Well, when Christy called me, she said, your task is to speak to urgency. And then I learned that I was following Alyssa, and I thought, if you don't get urgency after whatever it is that she's going to say, then, you know, what are we doing here? So it's a hard charge. And I was thinking, you know, where does my own sense of urgency come from around these issues? And you know, I worked with Ambassador Crocker at the State Department when Secretary Clinton was Secretary of State. And you know, I studied human rights at the Fletcher School, and I was in the Human Rights Bureau at the State Department, and I did that kind of diplomacy around human rights and democracy, and that was always my beat. And in 2017, I moved to Houston, in part because I thought it would be interesting. It has been. And about 6 weeks later, Hurricane Harvey happened in Houston. And it was one of the most dramatic climate events in American history. And you know, we often think of climate disasters like a Hurricane Katrina, like a fundamentally rare but very dramatic, large-scale hurricane. And what was interesting about Hurricane Harvey was that it was basically a long rainstorm that hung over the city for days and days and days until the ground was so saturated that flooding happened across the vast expanse of Houston. And I ended up at the mass congregant shelter at the George R. Brown Convention Center. I was a volunteer. And you know, here I am, I'm a policy person, a diplomat, and I wasn't totally sure what I was going to do with myself. And the guy who was the housing director was running this mass congregant shelter, 10,000 people. And at the end of this sort of very intense 2 weeks, he said, you know, why don't you stick around? I think we could use you at the housing department. And so I went from the State Department to the housing department for the city of Houston, where I ended up doing policy stuff. It really changed the course of my professional life and my life. I don't know if we can pull up Alyssa's slide of the heat map from 2015? Okay, we'll give you a second. But I live now in a place that is at the heart of so many of these things that we're talking about, where, you know, for me, I was used to traveling around the world and dealing with human rights issues, with democracy issues. And now I live in a place where, you know, extreme heat is not an abstract concept. Last summer, we had just month after month of 100+ degree days in Houston. And you know, if you look at this map, there are not very many places within the United States that are in that kind of deep orange. But Houston is, even in this 2015, sort of right there in the Gulf. And so these issues around how climate affects us have become quite personal. And now, you know, if you had asked me when I was in graduate school if I would be in a program dedicated to climate and geopolitics, I would not have believed you. And yet here I am, because the issues around climate and people are so inexorably linked. And I am, you know, no longer just sort of an observer of what's happening, but really a participant, because what happens in the climate really affects my life. I live in a house that's elevated above the second story, very tightly sealed. We think a lot about climate resilience in day-to-day life in Houston. And this is not just an experience that is unique to places like Houston. So one of the things I like to do is ask, who here has experienced, who's survived a climate disaster? Or do you know someone who has? Yeah. You guys had some tornadoes here. Hurricanes. Yeah. Anyone know people who've experienced? Yeah. So it's an increasingly universal experience in even, you know, places like Williamsburg. I grew up in Alexandria. We did not think a lot about climate disasters when I was growing up, and now, you know, I don't know about your family text chain, but my family text chain blows up with like, how's the weather in Boston, and you know, the weather in Texas, the weather in Virginia. People are constantly checking in on each other because of extreme weather events, and this has just become a much more universal experience than it was even 10 or 15 years ago. So we're going to hear a lot today about so we're going to do some really deep dives. I'm so excited about what Tomo and Johnson are going to talk about, giving us that perspective on what's happening in Africa, in Asia. And I wanted, what could my contribution be here if not to, I couldn't follow Alyssa on conveying that kind of like the intense sort of storytelling of urgency. But I thought maybe I could provide a kind of policy map to help us think about, to help us overlay what to do about this problem. So if we can go to the first of my slides. It's always dangerous when you think, I'm going to put up a slide that is intended for the US military. Because they're not great at slides, but it's okay, we're going to go with it. So the theme of this is that, and it's really what Alyssa was saying, that it's not just about the climate. It's about how climate interacts with governance and economy and all these other things. And that when we think about the interventions that are possible, that we have to think about the full range of places where we could intervene. And I think there's a temptation to think that we have to intervene on the level of, how do we prevent hurricanes? And there is a lot of work that's happening around how do we, reduce emissions, reduce global temperatures, all of that. That's very important. But the thing that leads us to conflict is not the fact that there are hurricanes or the fact that there are droughts. The thing that gets us to conflict is the absence of governance, the instability of housing, the openings that are created by, for non-state actors or for gangs to intervene and to provide services to people and to become empowered. And so when we think about the different kinds of policy interventions that are possible with this problem, I think we have to think about the full spectrum of the problem, both the climate changing itself, droughts, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, but then the second and third order effects of those problems that then lead us to the instability, conflict, the propensity for violence. So there are places that you can intervene that are not just, you don't just have to be a great innovator on carbon capture in order to address this problem. That addressing things like housing insecurity or the quality of governance or the prevalence of corruption are also places to intervene when we think about how do we pull back from the possibility of violence. And as we're listening today to all the different kinds of things that are happening in the world, that's what I want us to be thinking about, that there are multiple places, especially if you're a law student, and you are unlikely to become a climate scientist, that there are places where you can and should intervene and make a difference. I wanted to, it's fine, we'll skip that one, it doesn't matter. So the second thing I wanted to drill down, so there's this intersection of governance, of economy, and how that interacts with climate seems like a central theme. The second thing that I want us to think about and that makes this more complex is that the very interventions that you might do to reduce emissions have also the potential to increase, to lead to instability. So at Carnegie right now, one of the things that I'm doing, we're convening a task force on clean energy supply chains. And we're looking at 10 different supply chains for things like, oh, there we go. This is, see, it's like, they're not the best at clarity. But what I like about this, I'm gonna get up, is that here's your climate effects. And you gotta get all the way over here before you get to the kinds of outcomes that we're worried about. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in between. So if you're facing sea level rise or extreme heat, and you have crop failures, and you have food insecurity that's pre-existing, then you might get to a critical pathway juncture, as they like to say, that would lead you to the increased possibility of instability and violence. So this to me is so exciting because it gives you a picture, a mental map of where there is a possibility for interventions that are not just about sea level rise or extreme heat, but about all the other things in human life that policy people, that law people tend to like to think about. So I did just want to touch quickly on critical minerals, because the things that we are doing to address the first order effects of climate change on the far left are the mass movement towards electrification. And what I was saying is that at Carnegie, we're doing a task force on clean energy supply chains. And what we're looking at is things like batteries, wind, solar, green concrete, steel, shipping, aviation, all the things that are required for us to reduce the temperature, to reduce emissions. And all of those things are dependent on things like critical minerals. So 70% of the world's cobalt is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a region that is also affected by the changing climate and the lack of governance that leads to increased instability. So all of these things are connected. None of it is simple. And there is a lot to talk about today and that we're going to think about and learn from. I want to kind of close. Christy had asked me, she said, we need a policy person. And when I taught at the business school at NYU, I was teaching about social stuff and business. And what is policy? And since we're in a law school, I've come to think of policy, when you're an advocate, basically I think of public policy as how do you get the government to do stuff? And when you're in government, the question is how do you get the government to do stuff? To change the behavior of groups of people, to incentivize different kinds of actions, to disincentivize other kinds of actions. And that's how I think about policy, and that's where I find the most kind of optimism or opportunity as we think about this kind of incredibly depressing topic. That if we can go to the next slide. I love this. So I don't know if anybody remembers the Kentucky floods a couple years ago. I study disaster, and so I have like a whole database of disasters in America, and I was talking to some organizers after these floods. And someone sent this to me right after the election last year, that it turns out that the way that the government responds to disasters is incredibly powerful, and that people really notice how the government shows up when you're in a moment of crisis. And when the government shows up in a way that is helpful, that helps you stay in your house or be secure or have access to food or take care of your family members, that people remember that and deliver political rewards for that. And there's this very interesting narrative about Andy Beshear's re-election as governor of Kentucky that tied his re-election to the disaster response that he led in response to those floods. And to me, this is the sense of possibility that I draw on. I do a lot of work with people who would never describe themselves as climate activists, but who are in fact climate organizers. They're community organizers in places that are repeatedly affected by disaster around the country. And Jody Stewart is in rural New Jersey. And when she speaks, she says, "I'm a Sandy survivor, and that is a political identity." And the experience of surviving a disaster causes you to raise really significant personal questions about the role of government in your life, and potentially to demand more of the government in a way that I think there's not a lot of places where I see a sense of possibility in terms of democratic healing in America right now. But if you have lived through a disaster and you have seen the way that the government does or doesn't show up, that is an incredibly powerful organizing force in people's lives. And it is a place where I see the possibility, at least, of the kind of democratic work that is necessary for us not only to get out of the climate crisis, but also the democracy crisis. So I'm going to close there. I'm really excited to hear what we're going to learn today.